Today, I'm going to be talking about The Silence of the Lambs. To enter the mind of a killer, she must challenge the mind of a madman. The Silence of the Lambs is a 1991 film about a young FBI trainee who is hunting a serial killer who skins and butchers his victims. To better understand the motives of the killer, she attempts to get inside his mind with the help of an imprisoned psychopath, with whom she plays a deadly psychological game of cat and mouse. Silence of the Lambs, released on Valentine's Day in 1991, impacted audiences all over the world through its horrifying story, yet oddly overall redeeming meaning. Sure, some of the aspects of the movie would not and should not hold merit today, such as the sole use of a transvestite as the serial killer, or portraying all mentally ill people as villains. But what the film thrives off of is its powerful portrayal of a female lead in Jodie Foster. Overall, what makes the film important? In 1992, the film swept the major categories at the Oscars. It was only the third film in history to win all five big awards: Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Film. It is also the only horror film to win Best Picture. This achievement was obtained through many aspects of the film. Some would say the aspect most responsible is the master performance put on by Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. To put Hopkins' level of greatness into perspective, he holds the record for winning the Oscar for Best Actor with the least amount of screen time, only 15 minutes and 38 seconds. In addition to their acting skills, the gripping storyline plays a role in why the film was and is so successful. It bounces between being terrifyingly thrilling, psychologically thrilling, and feministically thrilling. Sandepan Deb from LiveMint.com puts it perfectly by saying, quote, "It creates its own seamless world that pulls the viewer into it for those 2 hours," end quote. Adding to its importance is how well it is made. The director, Jonathan Demme, truly creates a world that people want to simultaneously be a part of and run away from. He creates a thrilling, terrifying, and enthralling experience unlike any other movie. Vincent Canby from the New York Times praised Demme's work back in 1991 for, quote, "handling big set pieces well," end quote, and being able to direct a thriller with, quote, "humor and subtlety," end quote, while, quote, "the gruesome details are vivid without being exploited," end quote. In Canby's review, he continuously applauds how the film was made. He wrote that the, quote, "dialogue is tough and sharp, literate without being literary," end quote. He also wrote about the sophistication of the film, especially in its use of sound. Deb from LiveMint.com also discussed the powerful use of sound by saying, quote, "There are other things too in the soundtrack that build a sense of dread in the viewer, but always in a muted, insidious way. Under the instrumental music, you hear helpless screams from far off. In the climax, when Starling is trapped by Buffalo Bill in a pitch-dark, cavernous space, the only sound is her fearful panting. It's terrifying," end quote. Technically speaking, according to ShotOnWhat.com, Silence of the Lambs is shot using a Panavision Panaflex camera with vertical film orientation. They also used Panavision lenses, a spherical camera aperture, and a Dolby SR sound system. The way the film was overall shot displayed the emotion of the characters brilliantly. It left the audience with chills down their spine quite often. Now, let's discuss its power and its genre. The debates about what genre to consider The Silence of the Lambs have endured for decades. Some people say it's a horror or thriller film, while others want the distinction between it and something like slasher to be so large that they can't even be in the same genre category. There are so many different elements to the movie. It has horrific moments, but also it's a crime-solving movie, also a psychological thriller, while also having some strong feministic elements. It remains incredibly challenging to put the film into one category. Mark Junkovich from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom described the genre debate in his academic paper, Genre in the Audience, Genre Classifications and Cultural Distinctions in the Mediation of the Silence of the Lambs. He wrote that, quote, "distributors of The Silence of the Lambs had tried to negotiate a special status for the film as distinct from the ordinary horror film, capable of appealing to those who identified themselves as far removed from the horror fan. This is, end quote. This is an important point because the film was so widely successful. People who were not fans of horror films found meaning and value in The Silence of the Lambs. Reviews of the film did not typically describe it as a horror movie either. Jankovic wrote that, quote, "The only generic identification I have been able to find in reviews and commentary published in mainstream, middle-class, or quality publications describes the film as a suspenseful drama," end quote. The strategy that many reviewers used was, quote, to simultaneously present the film as offering pleasures of a horror movie while also legitimatizing the film through its distinction from the genre, end quote. The distinction from the genre comes from the movie's aesthetics. The film is aesthetically and politically feminist well before its time. When I say the film is aesthetically feminist, I'm talking about having the main character be a female training in the, quote, male chauvinistic FBI, according to Mia Pierce from ScreenRant.com. She also states that if you, quote, watch the film closely, you may even conclude that it's really about gender discrimination, not sly psychos running amok, end quote. Throughout the film, it's constantly made apparent that Jodie Foster's character, Clarice, is the only female in the room. It becomes almost comical throughout the movie, because it seems like every man she comes in contact with has to flirt with her. Pierce comments on this in her article by saying, "Hardly anyone openly leers at Starling, but there is an air of hostility and condescension that is palpable if the viewer is paying attention," end quote. The uncomforting nature of how Clarice is treated because she is a woman becomes one of the most redeeming values of the movie, because it highlights how palpable gender discrimination is in the workplace, while also showing a powerful female lead that excels in her male-dominated world. The aesthetics of the film also come through the gripping dialogue and the sly interactions between Clarice and Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins' character. The relationship between the two could only be described as unique. There's a mutual respect, but also a desire for more on both sides. Clarice is so intrigued by the genius of Lecter and wants to learn more about him and from him, while Lecter constantly wants to push Clarice out of her comfort zone and make her come to conclusions on her own. For instance, Hannibal Lecter says, "Why do you think he removes their skins, Agent Starling? Enthrall me with your acumen." Clarice says, "It excites him. Most serial killers keep some sort of trophies from their victims." Lecter says, "I didn't," and she said, No, you ate yours." Lecter constantly challenges Clarice by asking her critical questions. He recognizes her talent and he pushes her to be the best she can be, while also being cannibalistic. Not only does he push her to solve the crime, he also forces her to analyze her own weaknesses and therefore has to allow him into her own mind. He will only give her clues to the case if she reveals critical memories from her childhood, which he is curious about because of his psychiatrist background. She has terrifying and pervasive memories of being a terrified child growing up on a sheep farm and hearing the lambs being slaughtered. He uses this memory that she reveals to him to manipulate her. He does this by saying things like, quote, "You still wake up sometimes, don't you? Wake up in the dark and hear the screaming of the lambs." She says, "Yes." He says, "And you think if you save poor Catherine, you can make them stop. You'll never wake up in the dark again to the awful screaming of the lambs." End quote. The dichotomy of his character is just one aspect of the film that makes it so enjoyable, and why, although he's only on screen for just over 15 minutes, his presence endures throughout the entire movie. In a lot of ways, Silence of the Lambs was before its time. Therefore, it did set the stage for future films for a lot of reasons. Pierce lists 5 aspects of the film that aged well, and 5 that did not, in her article on ScreenRant.com. Something she included that positively advanced cinema art is the idea that serial killers can be incredibly intelligent. The notion that serial killers were either incredibly dumb or just motivated by a sick form of lust was pretty relevant before The Silence of the Lambs. We as a society had not really seen a killer like Lecter. Lecter's use of his psychological genius to evaluate other serial killers was something completely new. Lecter remains a villain throughout the movie, but he also helps Clarice solve the Buffalo Bill case. Having an intelligent criminal is uncharted territory. Pierce writes that, quote, "Hannibal Lecter is brilliant, and even, and is a psychiatrist with a PhD. Films can be guilty of showing violent criminals as impulsive, frantic, and well, below average in intelligence. We don't see that at all with Hannibal. And while it's kind of frightening, it's really refreshing, and this is still one of the most interesting parts of this classic film." End quote. Silence of the Lambs also furthers cinema art by setting the stage for future powerful female leads. Although the movie shows a lot of sexualization of the only female in the room, quite often, it also blatantly displays a powerful, brilliant, and brave woman who excels at her job. Mast, the author of A Short History of the Movies, describes The Silence of the Lambs as, quote, "full of ferocious, gruesome characters and events, portrays them without compromising their horrific nature, and becomes troubling without being troubled," end quote. The Silence of the Lambs has continuously enthralled audiences for almost 30 years. It is truly unlike any other film, especially from the time it was made. Even with today's technology, it still holds up as one of the best thriller movies out there. Foster and Hopkins' immaculate portrayals of their fascinating characters, combined with the incredibly fascinating storyline, creates a film that will stand up with the best for the rest of time. And here are my works cited.